Good. We're going to go ahead and get started then. We're very pleased to have everybody here. We apologize for the delay. Usually we're on Swiss time, but today we're on, I guess, American time, which is delayed a few minutes. The reason for that is an exciting kind of new piece we're doing today, which is we are simultaneously broadcasting from Zurich and London and Asheville, although we're more the hub and the host. But we're going to have presentations from Murray Stein live out of Zurich, as well as Warren Coleman live out of London. And it took a little while to configure the threesome, but I hear it's up and running, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me do a brief introduction, and then we will turn it over to Murray and Zurich in a few minutes. So again, welcome to today's talk. It is entitled The Creation of Symbolic Meaning on the Path to Individuation. We are delighted to have so many people joining us from around the world yet again. We have 18 countries joining us today, and they include Australia, Brazil, Canada, France, India, Iran, Israel, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, Republic of Georgia, Slovenia, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, United States, and Uruguay. So again, we thank those folks. Most of those are live. Most of those people are live watching us. Australia may not be. There's an occasional brave soul that's up at 3 in the morning in Australia to watch us, but they'll probably do the taped recording. We want to mention who we are. We're from the Asheville Young Center. Most of you know us by now. Do check out our website if you haven't already, ashevilleyoungcenter.org. There we have live seminars like today, recorded seminars, DVDs, social media, and an ongoing blog. And please take advantage of those if possible. A few announcements. We are about to start a new continuing education program. We went through considerable time and expense to apply through the American Psychological Association as well as the California Behavioral Health Science Board, and we are accredited by those two agencies. So starting the next seminar, we'll have full accreditation for that, and we'll be sending out some information along those lines. We're also going to get some of our older DVDs and make those home study packages. So in the future, you'll be able to get continuing education credit from a full professional standard on that. So stay tuned for that. August 26th, 2 months from now, will be a new series on film and archetypal psychology. Jungian psychology. We'll be looking at Black Swan from a depth psychological perspective, and that should be a really exciting piece, if people can tune in for that. Our last DVD, or our last seminar, Introduction to Jungian Therapy by Dr. Murray Stein, will be available shortly on DVD. We have that back from the publisher. We're about to have the proofs finalized, and that will be released within a week or two, we suspect. And we'll send out an email when that is off and running. I want to mention the Archive for Research in Archetypal Symbolism briefly. That's known as ARAS, A-R-A-S. You can find them at aras.org. I mention them because today's talk is on symbolism, on symbolic meaning, and they are a wonderful resource of symbolic imagery that you can subscribe to, you can download. They have a new book entitled The Book of Symbols that's available, and if you're interested in symbols, you may want to look at that a little more. I want to acknowledge those participating today. We want to thank the University of North Carolina, Asheville. That's where I'm seated right now, and that's our hub here. And the departments of psychology and the distance learning centers have been very helpful, instrumental in leading this today, as well as the NC Ren system. They're out of Raleigh, North Carolina, at least the Triangle Park area. The ETH University, also known as the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, is where Murray is seated right now, and they are helping with that broadcast site. That is also where Carl Jung taught. He was a professor at the ETH, so there's a nice historical piece from that. I'd like to thank the Tavistock Center for Couples Relations in London, and that is where Warren Coleman is seated and where he's broadcasting from. And Tavistock has been kind enough to allow us to use their broadcast facility today. ISAP Zurich is the institute that Murray is president of, the Jungian Training Institute in Zurich, one of them, and they have been very kind to loan us their professors, their analysts, quite often for these talks, so we want to thank them. The Centro Mexicano de C.G. Jung from Mexico City isn't fully connected today. They often do a full audio-video connection. They are going to do a web connection, so they've shifted that connection today, but we want to thank them for their participation and hope that they can offer some email questions and comments with us today. Other sites that are connected include the Omaha Friends of Jung and the San Antonio Young Center. Plus, of course, a couple hundred people around the world that are connected through individual computers. Few housekeeping items. Briefly, I'm required to announce that we have no commercial support for presenters, topics, or programs. There is no pharmaceutical industry support of any kind associated with us today. We will be sending out a brief survey after today's seminar, and we do ask people to give us your feedback on the surveys. That is indeed helpful to us. Anybody that's on a live university site, realize that this is being taped, it's being recorded, and if you don't want your voice on the subsequent DVD, ask any questions in writing to one of the presenters, myself or the other sites, and we'll ask them. Otherwise, you may be on the DVD that comes out later on. Remember, we have a couple hundred people joining us today. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but we may not be able to answer all the questions that are sent to us. For the questions, if you're at a computer, a home computer, email us at the email address we gave you, which is info@ashevilleyoungcenter.org, and that is the best way to ask questions. There's a button on your home viewer screen that says Ask a Question. Don't push that, because that goes into Jungian Neverland, limbo, and we will never see it. You can do it, but it won't. It'll make it to the collective unconscious, but it won't make it to me. Please turn off all cell phones, of course, or put them to vibrate if you don't mind. Also, for the home viewers, play around with the viewing buttons. There's one called Swap the Media. We can swap back and forth between PowerPoint, which will be just London, and the video, and you can make them larger or smaller. You can hit the full screen button, which will expand it, but look at the buttons on the right-hand side, and that will help your viewing experience. So with that, let me introduce our two speakers today. First off, from Zurich will be Murray Stein. Murray, most of you know. He's done the majority of our seminars, often with other analysts as well. Murray is the current president of the International School of Analytical Psychology, ISAP. He's the past president of the International Association of Analytical Psychology, which is the main organizing body for Jungian analysts. He is a founding member of 2 Jungian institutes. He is a wonderfully gifted teacher, which you'll see today, very good at bringing complex material alive to us. He has written a book, which I forgot to bring today, but a recently published book called Jungian Psychoanalysis, Working in the Spirit of Carl Jung. It is really a fabulous text, taking some of the best authors, the best Jungian analysts from around the world, and they write individual chapters, one of which is Warren Coleman, which many of you have already read, and his chapter is in that book, as are many others. So excellent book if you get a chance. I'm going to introduce Warren Coleman right now as well, although you'll see him more in about half hour or so. Warren is a Jungian analyst based outside of London. He is extensively trained in pastoral counseling, psychodynamic psychotherapy, marital therapy, and of course Jungian analysis. He has published extensively and has been a training analyst at multiple organizations. He is currently editor-in-chief of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, which is one of the main Jungian journals that are out there, and most of you probably know. So, without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Murray Stein in Switzerland. Thank you very much, Murray.
Well, thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
And we need a little more volume, at least in Asheville. I don't know if other sites do it, but NC Run, if you can bump up the volume a bit, that would be good. But, go ahead, Murray.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay. I was just saying it's a pleasure to be with you again, though virtually, not physically. And also with Warren. Last time I saw Warren, we were in physical proximity to each other in St. Petersburg, Russia. This was about a month ago for a conference that sponsoring with the Journal of Analytical Psychology. So it's very nice to be on this program with Warren, and I look forward to hearing him. I'm going to do a kind of quick crash course introduction to Jung on symbols and the symbolic life. And then Warren will deliver his reflections, and then we'll have some time for discussion. We'll take a break and have some further conversation and presentations after the break. So what I'd like to do is answer a couple of questions from strictly pretty much Jung's perspective. I'm not going to go very far out from Jung himself and what he wrote, because I'd like to make sure that everybody has a clear understanding of what Jung meant by a symbol, what a symbol is. I'm going to try to answer some questions. What is a symbol? Where do symbols come from? Where do they originate? Where do we find symbols? What is the purpose of symbols? What is their goal, psychologically speaking? And what is symbolic meaning? So that's quite a bit to try to cover in a half an hour. I'll do my best. If you took the opportunity to read the assignments for this course that were sent out in advance, by Jung, I suggested reading The Transcendent Function, the Tavistock Lectures, Symbolic Life, and the Definition of Symbol in the Collected Works, Volume 6. You'll see that Jung repeats himself over and over again on what a symbol is not and what it is, particularly around the distinction of the difference between what he calls a sign and a symbol. When you deal with symbols, Jung would say you're dealing with nuclear material. You're dealing with very powerful psychological material. It's nothing to play around with. It can unleash enormous energies. And because a symbol connects us to the depths of the unconscious. And I'll show you in a moment a diagram that he presented to his audience at the Tavistock Lectures, 1935, in London, that illustrates or gives a visual impression of what he had in mind when he talks about symbols and where they come from. But the difference between a symbol and a sign, which is a critical difference, is that signs belong entirely to the conscious mind, whereas symbols do not. The sign is an object or a drawing or a picture that stands for something that you otherwise already know. It's simply a substitution of one thing for another. For instance, the stop sign tells you to stop. Everybody knows what it means. There's no mystery about it. There's nothing unknown about it. It's very simple. It's a simple equation. One thing stands for another. It tells you what to do. Or you see an arrow pointing in a certain direction, or you see a sign on a bathroom door. It tells you it's for men, it's for women, so on. Those are signs. And they belong entirely to culture, to consciousness, to what we already know. Whereas Jung wants to say that a symbol brings us something that we don't already know, that it contains information that we have a hard time getting our hands around. It takes us a long time to try to understand what a symbol might be directing us toward. And so Jung had a method for trying to understand and interpret symbols, which we'll talk quite a bit about in the course of this seminar. But it doesn't readily, its meaning is not readily apparent. And so if you come across a symbol, you'll usually be puzzled. You'll say, what does that mean? What are you trying to say? What is the dream saying? You don't know what it says. And that's important. That means you're dealing with a symbol and not a sign. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, the difference between a symbol and a sign. Now, there are many kinds of signs, too. Metaphors are a kind of sign, in that one thing stands for another. My love is a red, red rose. You don't literally think that your beloved, is a rose, unless you're in love with roses, I guess. But it's a metaphor that says something about the beloved, but there isn't a great deal of mystery in that. It's an interesting comparison. Roses are beautiful, your love must be beautiful, you're very fond of it, she smells good, so on and so forth. Metaphors also stretch the mind. And it's very difficult to think without metaphors, in fact. Metaphors are essential to our thinking, and they extend our thinking in ways that we otherwise wouldn't be able to. But a symbol is not a metaphor in the sense that insofar as a metaphor belongs entirely to consciousness and is created by consciousness. A symbol is also not a substitute for another object. There was a very important and much discussed and often referred to paper written at an early Congress. In 1962, the IAP Congress, I think it was the second one in the history of the IAP, there were a number of papers on symbols, and one of them was given by a then Jungian analyst who later became a psychoanalyst, you'll see why in a moment, named Murray Jackson. And it's a very interesting paper. I reviewed it before this seminar, read it again. He has a particular view of symbols as a kind of substitute, but not such an obvious substitute. He says that a symbol stands in for something else, but one doesn't know that it's standing in for that other thing. In that sense, it's a bit mysterious. He says that a symbol is an object that is invested with what he calls projective identification. In other words, we transfer from one object the meaning and the significance of that object number one into object number two, so that object number two stands in for and represents and means the same thing, and we relate to in a very similar way number two to what number one would be. And so transference, for instance, if you think of transference as a kind of symbolic relationship in that sense, projective identification, the analyst might stand in or substitute for your mother or your father, and you really could mistake them for them.
It just dropped. Where can you hear?
Example. Can you hear me?
We can now. The video froze. Yeah, we're good again. Okay. Go ahead and restart. Sorry about that.
Not only a cigar. Okay. And he gave the example of a patient of his who had difficulty in his sexual life. I'm hearing an echo from this side, a little irritating. We're getting an echo, Steve.
Okay. Central Control, can you reduce the echo?
Yep, I'm working it.
Okay, yeah, all right, thanks.
So back to the example, the man had difficulty with his sexual functioning because he was ashamed of his penis. He didn't want anybody to see his penis. And so he could masturbate and so on, but he couldn't have normal sexual relations with his wife, at least when the lights were on, for fear that his penis would be seen. And in the course of the analysis, Murray Jackson had the habit of occasionally smoking a cigar in the sessions. It's a very interesting story that he recounts in his paper. And the patient noticed this, and he said, I like to smoke cigars too, but I'm afraid to smoke them in public. I don't want anybody to see me smoking a cigar. And immediately, Murray Jackson's mind translates that, oh, well, the cigar is a substitute for the penis. He's afraid of having his penis seen by anybody, and he doesn't want anybody to see him smoking a cigar. Clearly, these two objects, one stands for the other one. And he's invested the cigar with, he's projected into it the meaning of the penis. And so in the course of things, Murray Jackson would smoke his cigar in the sessions, and slowly, the patient also gained the courage to bring cigars to the session and eventually could comfortably smoke cigars in sessions with Murray Jackson and eventually also in public. And lo and behold, his sexual functioning improved as well. He was able to have sexual intercourse. He wasn't worried about his wife seeing his penis anymore. And so this dissolved, this projective identification dissolved. In fact, the neurosis dissolved, and the case came out very nicely. So there you see that the cigar really is a stands-in. It's a substitute for the penis, invested with projective identification. And Murray Jackson makes the point that most symbols, in fact, I think he says all symbols, because he, at that moment, was studying Klein and was very influenced by Kleinians, all symbols have a somatic or physical base to them. At the core of the symbol, there is a body part. It's either a breast or a penis or some other part of the body. And in the response to this talk, the Jungian analyst who was responding took strong exception by saying that that's not at all what Jung means by symbols. They are not substitutes for something else. They are original and numinous products of the unconscious. They bring something we don't know yet. They aren't standing for something we know and we just don't know that we know. They stand for something new. In fact, they free us from our obsessions and our neuroses. And so she took a view of symbols. It was Esther Harding, who was the respondent to Murray Jackson. She said he doesn't really understand what symbols mean from a Jungian perspective. And there was a very big difference in their approach. So for Murray Jackson, symbols referred to body parts, could be reduced to body parts, to something physical. And for Esther Harding, they referred to something, you could say, of the spirit, something spiritual, something intangible, something beyond us that we don't know of already. And so I think this is a very instructive conversation between those two people to make the point that when Jung speaks about a symbol, he has in mind something that you can't really define, even if you uncover its some of its meanings. There's always more. There's always something still elusive, something still unconscious, something that it carries that cannot be pinned down exactly. And so for Jung, symbols bring something into consciousness from the unconscious and from the depths of the unconscious, or often the archetypal unconscious, that we hadn't been aware of, that hadn't been available to conscious before that. And so the appearance of symbols have very much to do with expanding, extending consciousness as they arise in our dreams, in our imagination, or wherever we happen to confront them. The symbol for Jung is a bridge, in that it connects the conscious mind and the unconscious. And Jung felt that there was a great problem in modern consciousness, in modernity, that resulted from the gradual separation of the conscious mind from the unconscious mind, from the archaic or the primitive or the old brain, however you want to think about it, the instinctual mind, that as humans developed in culture over the centuries, and as their cultures gradually moved more toward sign cultures and away from symbolic cultures, away from mythological cultures into scientific cultures, different way of understanding the world, we human beings paid a huge price by losing contact with the deep layers of the unconscious mind. And for our mental health, it's important to be in touch with our instincts. That modern man, as Jung looked at modern man, sorry for the gender, modern human being, the person who lives in modernity and is more or less convinced that modernity has the truth. It's a kind of flat culture, a kind of flat world in which signs are very prevalent, but the sense of the symbolic is very absent. And the danger is that people are cut off from their instinctual knowledge, from a kind of knowledge that Jung felt primitives have. Jung was very interested in the primitive mind and studying the primitive mind because he felt that so-called primitive people don't have this problem. They aren't cut off from their instincts the way we are. And so they aren't neurotic. Neurosis comes out of this gap that develops between the conscious mind and the unconscious. Consciousness becoming more and more one-sided, more and more rational, quotes rational, and out of contact with the deeper layers of the unconscious, with one's instinctual background. And that symbols have the capacity to bridge this, that symbols can link the archaic mind to the highly rational conscious mind. When Jung gave a talk in 1939, a very difficult year in European history, as I'm sure all of you know, just at the brink of the beginning of the Second World War, he was in London again, and this time he was addressing a group called the Guild of Pastoral Psychology. There were a lot of clergy people in that audience. And he gave an address or answered questions, gave a little spontaneous talk, it was off the cuff. And in answer to questions that they raised, and he got going on the subject of what he called the symbolic life. And by the symbolic life, he means a life lived in relationship to mostly cultural symbols, but then he would get into what are some possibilities for individual symbols as well, the individual symbolic life. But he says in traditional life, in a mythological age, let's say before the Reformation in Europe, in the Middle Ages, for instance, people lived within a symbolic universe, and they lived with symbols. And what the symbols did for them was connect them to their own psyches, contained their archetypal images, and gave them a feeling of being connected to something beyond themselves, beyond their own individual lives. They didn't just live an individual personal life. They lived, or had the potential to live, a life of transcendent meaning in relation to God, to the saints, to the devils, to all those invisible beings that inhabited their imaginal world, their mythological world, angels, and so on and so forth. And that this, from a psychological point of view, he says, is a much healthier way to live than the way we live today in modern times. And so he lamented the fact that people no longer have myths to live in and live by. He said when a priest goes to the altar, if he really believes in the symbolic meaning of the Mass, he is a part of the sacrifice. He becomes a sacrifice. He is identified with Christ. And the host and the wine actually become the body and blood of Christ that he shares with his congregation, he takes for himself. And this living in relation to these symbols has an effect on his life. It gives him meaning. It gives him a sense of transcendence. It gives him something much larger than his own individual and rather insignificant, usually, life. It puts him into contact with much larger meanings and beings. We don't have that today, he said. But he said human beings need it. And if they don't have it around them in their culture, they tend to get very desperate, and they will find it somewhere. And so the contents, the archetypal contents that were formerly projected into these mythological beings, theological universes and so on, are now projected elsewhere into ideologies, into nationalities, nationalism. People have a desperate need to have some larger meaning than their own banal life. He says life is so banal. If you live it on a strictly personal level, you need something greater. And he said, when people realize that a war is imminent, they get very excited because at least now something is happening. He said, something meaningful is going to happen, something greater than myself. And so when he looked around the world in 1939 and he saw these figures who are all pumped up with mythological projections, Der Führer in Germany, who was striding around like a colossus, a titan, and threatening the whole world with his madness, and everybody bowing down and worshiping, he saw this as a huge danger that religion had been transferred over into politics. But he also realized that people have a need for this kind of archetypal meaning. They need to belong to something greater than themselves. And symbols give that to them. That's what symbols can do for them. And so somebody had asked him, well, why, if you think symbols are so great in the symbolic life, why don't you join the Catholic Church? You're a Protestant, you live in Zurich. Protestants don't have any symbols much. And Jung lamented that. He lives here in Zurich. Zwingli had ripped all the altars and statues and beautiful images out of the churches that were very plain. All you did when you went to church was sit there and listen to the minister preach at you for an hour. There was no music for a long time. They didn't celebrate Christmas, nothing. It was very, very dull and very gray. And I think Jung would have been very happy to live in the 13th century in Chartres and be a monk. He would have been much more content than living in Zurich with this absence, dreadful absence of symbolism around him. So they said, well, why don't you become a Catholic? And he said, I know too much. I understand it. And once you understand what a symbol is talking about, once it's emptied of its meaning, once it's emptied of its mystery, and you understand it, you know all the theological concepts, you know how they work, you know that this means this and that means that. He says the symbol dies. Then you have a dead symbol. And that's what's happened to Western religions. It's what happened to Protestantism. It killed the spirit of religion, and now it's an ethical society, a moral society. Decent, godless folk get together once in a while and preach at each other. And there's no power in it. It doesn't do anything for your psyche anymore. It gives you some moral lessons, but it can't elevate you. But on the other hand, he wrote a paper on the symbolism of the Mass. He wrote a paper on the doctrine of the Trinity. He spelled it all out. He says, I understand that stuff. I can't go back to it. Once you understand the symbolic meaning of a previous era, it doesn't work for you anymore. It's not a living symbol. So he said, we have to discover new symbols. Well, how do we do that? Where do symbols come from? Where do they originate? He offers a drawing in the Tavistock lectures. Chris, could I have this picture? Chris? Chris, do you hear me? Okay. I'd like to show my I could show my pictures now.
It's occupied by this picture. I cannot send it.
Oh, you can't send it as long as there's that one.
The red sheet, you can change the.
Okay. So where do symbols come from? Where do they originate? I'll show you this picture in a moment. Symbols cannot be created by the conscious mind. Okay, you can't make them up. They're not arbitrary. You can't sit down and say, now I'm going to make a symbol for myself. You have to find it somewhere. Individuals can't create symbols, and cultures can't create symbols. They have to arise. They have to come out of this center down here. Now here's a picture he drew for his audience at the Tavistock, and he says you go from an ecto system that is facing outward. Here he has the four functions: sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. You can see intuition is closest to the ectopsychic systems inside here. And on the inside, in the first circle, you have memory. That's something you have access to, more or less, if you've got a good memory. Then you have selective, then you have affects. Finally, you have what he calls invasions down here, invasions. So those are ideas or images that just press into your mind. And at the very core, as you go all the way down into the center of there, it gets darker and darker. At the core, you have the nuclear material. Okay, that's the collective unconscious. And he says, when material comes out of that core, it confronts you, usually on the outside. Usually you don't, you can get it on the inside. It can come to you in the form of a dream or a spontaneous vision, but often, he says, it comes to you from the outside. That is, it gets projected out onto an object, and then your sensation or your thinking, your feeling picks it up coming at you from the outside. So this is the phenomenon of projection. Where do symbols come from? They come from the core. Where do you find them? Well, you can find them inside yourself or outside yourself. And what he had in mind there was that where people were finding their symbols in the 1930s was largely outside. I mean, on a collective level. They were not, maybe as patients were finding them on the inside in their dreams and their active imaginations and so on. The invasions were coming from within, but often they were coming at them from outside. So you had these powerful collective movements going on in Europe, generating a lot of mythological material and enthusiasm and so on. He wrote a paper in 1936 called it the Wotan paper, in which he talks about what was going on in Germany as a reappearance of ancient mythological projections on the leader, the Führer, so on and so forth, in very primitive, regressed fashion. So the material, that nuclear material from the inside, comes at you in the form of a projection. And if you can see through that projection, if you can get some distance from it, and here we come back to Murray Jackson's point, it's a projective identification, all right, of a mythological figure onto something in the environment, but you don't really know what it is. What is this that's being projected onto the savior figures out there? Well, it's a savior archetype, you could say. But what is that? What's it saving you from? So on. You start reflecting on that, and you start questioning it, and pretty soon you can get a grip, and you can start seeing the object a little more clearly because it isn't as covered up by the projection. So the symbols can be found inside or outside, and here's a picture I got off the internet. One of the students at ISAP, Christine Miller by name, maybe she's listening to this program, I don't know, wrote a symbol paper at ISAP on this picture. This is an image taken by the Hubble telescope out in outer space. It's actually a composite of images taken by NASA's Hubble Space Telescope, and it's been dubbed the Eye of God. If you look at it, it looks like an eye. It's actually the Helix Nebula, far out it's a galaxy of stars, and they think there's a black hole at the center of it. And you have a scientific explanation of this, but as people looked at this image and projected into it, they started seeing an eye looking back at them. And so there was a lot of discussion on the internet. Is this actually the eye of God looking at us, looking back at us? And this isn't a very good picture, but if you go online, just type in the eye of God, Hubble, you'll get this picture, and it really is quite striking. And if you look at it with that in mind, this is an eye looking at us from outer space, looking back at us. You could start making some mythology about it. You might be able to project some archetypal material into that. And so you get another consciousness looking back at you. Jung would say, you're projecting the self into that. God is when you project the self onto something, it becomes a God figure. And so it's very powerful, and it can create religious movements and all kinds of excitement and enthusiasm, or it can become a personal symbol for people. Now here's another picture that I found at the train station in Zurich the other day. You see the bull and the bear. Another student at ISOP wrote his a symbol paper and then a thesis on the stock market. And as you know, the bull and the bear symbolize two movements in the stock market. The bull is an upward pressure on prices going up enthusiastically, and the bear is a pressure coming down. Selling is strong, and the stock market is falling. And he wrote a very interesting thesis, taking these images not as signs, okay? What I just described were these images as signs. The bull tells you one thing, the bear tells you the other thing. But he said the stock market, in fact, and he's very knowledgeable about this, having lived a whole life in the financial world, the stock market actually is very irrational. It isn't a rational phenomenon, and anybody who goes into it deeply realizes that the movements in the stock market aren't based on rational calculations. They're based on emotion. And if you can read the animal level of the market, he says, you might do better in your investments. So these two animals actually have to do with the irrational, instinctual basis of the movement in the financial markets. So he's taking them as symbols. Now, there's animal movement, there are instinctual movements. I sometimes think of stock markets moving irrationally as birds suddenly flying in a certain direction. You don't know why they're doing that. Why they change course all of a sudden? Nobody knows. People come up with all kinds of rational explanations afterwards, but nobody's very convinced by that. So you find irrational symbols all around you in the world about. That's the point I'm trying to make here. They aren't just inner phenomenon, they're also external. And as Jung says, this nuclear material can very easily be projected outwards, and then you get all kinds of irrational behavior on a collective level, often in the form of social movements, political movements, so on and so forth. Well, ultimately, from a psychological and psychotherapeutic point of view, the appearance of symbols in a person's life, particularly if it comes in the form of dreams, has to do with the psyche's attempt to overcome the one-sidedness of consciousness. As consciousness develops and cuts itself off from its instinctual base and its archetypal base, dreams will appear, or visions, intuitions that are attempting to link back to its sources. And so you get powerful archetypal and symbolic dreams that have that effect if you take them seriously. Now, the seminar is on symbolic meaning, and as soon as we introduce the word meaning, I think we have to be aware that a symbol by itself, when it appears, might give us a kind of intuition of meaning, of belonging to something greater, giving us a sense of extension and size and connection to something more important than our own individual lives, which is a very important part of it. But also the word meaning brings into play the conscious mind interacting with a symbol and making interpretations about the symbol, and how you interpret the symbol and what you do with the symbol, a symbolic image of a dream or whatever form it comes to you, is extremely important in developing what Warren will in a few minutes take over and speak of as symbolic meaning. Meaning is generated by an interaction between the conscious mind and the symbol. Symbolic meaning is not offered by the symbol altogether by itself, because the symbol is just what it is, and it's often very opaque and very mysterious, and you don't know what to make of it. You have to think about it, and you have to associate to it, and you have to work on integrating its meaning into your life. And if you read Warren's paper, you can see how he recommends that can be done through process of interpretation. When Jung interpreted symbols, and he gives examples of this, he gives a very interesting and powerful example of a symbolic dream and how he works with it in Tavistock Lecture number 4. Just before he breaks off and starts talking about transference at the request of the audience. Unfortunately, in my mind, he didn't finish his discussion of this very interesting dream. You can see how he takes the pieces of the dream. It's a dream about a cathedral, a snake under the cathedral, a bowl, a sword, so on, a very mysterious place underneath a cathedral in Toledo, Spain. And he takes the pieces of the dream, the images, and he amplifies them. He goes into their historical associations. So the process of amplification is how he would engage with a symbol. Not so much personal associations, often there aren't many personal associations to a symbolic image in a dream, but collective associations from mythology, religion, culture. And he does a stupendous job of amplifying this dream to the point that when the questions arise, people in the audience is so intimidated by his amazing scholarship and extent of knowledge that they don't even know how to ask questions about what he's just said, so they steer him in another direction. It's quite interesting to see how that works. But he gets a hold of the symbol, the meaning of the symbol, by using parallel images from other contexts, other historical contexts. And he says symbols, the symbolic world has a language of its own. Symbols speak their own language. And it's like trying to read a foreign language, a language you don't know anything about. And you discover words that are repeated in different contexts, so you make yourself a dictionary. You know, how is the word used in this context? How is it used in that context? And gradually you can build up an understanding of what a word in the strange language of symbols might mean. So symbols are really the language for the inexpressible, for what we can't say. It's for our unthinkable thoughts. We can't get a hold of them. And so amplification is a way of trying to tease out the meaning of the symbol. So eventually we can understand this language, and it's important to understand it because it's giving us something very important for our lives, particularly in the area of meaning. So as Warren shows so beautifully in his paper, once you can symbolize something and understand the meaning of that symbol, you can verbalize it, you can metabolize it, you can digest it, you can integrate it. Until you have done that, it will sit there by itself. A dream might repeat itself over and over again. You get the same symbol popping up, but until you take hold of it, work it, and begin to be able to grasp with your conscious mind, this interaction between conscious and unconscious, begin to grasp what the symbol is driving at. What is this core nuclear material all about? What's it trying to bring you? You don't get to what we call symbolic meaning. Okay, symbolic meaning is generated by the interaction. You build a bridge between conscious and unconscious. The symbol allows you to build that bridge. It throws a rope over from the side of the unconscious, but you have to take that rope and then you have to work it and you have to bring yourself closer to it and fill it out. So that's the way we think of creating symbolic meaning. And that then moves toward individuation, which I'll pick up on some more after the break. But I would like to stop at this point and let Warren come in from London.
Well, I want to start off doing two things, really. The first thing is to set symbols in something of their cultural and historical context. And this touches on this distinction that Murray referred to between signs and symbols. Because in one sense, symbolic communication, broadly conceived, is definitive of human beings. We can be regarded as the homo symbolicus, and it's our capacity for using symbolic communication that distinguishes us from other animals. But when we talk about symbolic communication in this way, we're talking about symbols in a much broader sense, which would be included in what Jung meant by signs. And of course, most notably, that would include language. In this sense, symbols are a form of representation that go beyond direct one-to-one signification. Because in a very simple direct one-to-one signification, an example of this would be you can teach a rat to press a lever and the lever will give the rat food. So the lever indicates that there's food there. But if you stop putting the food there, after a little while, the lever will stop meaning anything to the rat. Whereas to us, the words rat and lever continue to mean something. And that's, this is a distinction that Terence Deacon makes in his book, The Symbolic Species. So in that broad sense, language is an interlocking system, a network of communication. And I'll be coming on to talk a bit more about networks later. So when we start to think about where symbolic communication comes from, it seems to me that this raises a very interesting and perplexing question, of which I have no idea of the answer. Because it's a question about what came first. My sense is that language seems to have probably originated amongst humans earlier than the use of symbols in the Jungian sense, because certainly the first symbolic objects don't turn up in the archaeological records until quite a long after humans will probably have some kind of language. But I think that symbols of all kinds emerge in the context of culture, and perhaps the beginnings of culture for humans was the use of tools. So these are the first objects that humans used, and in that context there's an early form of material culture out of which a more kind of psychic culture seems to have emerged. It used to be thought that the emergence of objects used for artistic, religious or decorative purposes could be dated to the Upper Paleolithic period. That's around 35,000 years ago, because there's an explosion of cultural artifacts that are found in Europe, figurines and so forth, that date from that period. But this has actually been overturned by the discovery of clearly symbolic objects in Africa, particularly from the Blombus caves in South Africa. And these date back around 75,000 years. And I want to show you a couple of these. Can you, yeah, that's right, here's my, this is the first of them. This remarkable object is a piece of ochre rock where you can see the surface has been smoothed and it's been engraved with geometric patterns. Nobody has any idea what these patterns mean, but it's quite clear that they mean something. They are a sign of intentional, purposive activity on the part of human beings like ourselves. And these are, as I say, 75,000 years old, so much earlier than it was thought that that kind of human symbolic representation existed. Another example from the Blombus caves is these shells, these you know, the shells with the holes in which are thought to have been used to make bead necklaces. Now, whatever kind of symbolic language this represents, it's clear that it's some kind of symbolic language. It has a meaning, a recognizable meaning that is beyond the practical use value of the object. Anthropologists now think that the use of red ochre for making paint or painting the body or painting other objects that also indicates some kind of symbolic behavior, very likely some kind of ritual behavior. This can be traced back over 100,000 years. And this suggests that humans have been prompted by more than survival needs to use material objects as a means of transforming the world, not only for a long time, but actually for as long as modern humans have existed. And it may be the very thing that distinguishes modern humans from earlier forms of humans that existed for the previous, I think it's about 1.5 million years. I think these objects indicate the emergence of a new form of imagination, which I call symbolic imagination. While it certainly takes some kind of imagination to fashion stone tools or to track an animal, there's clearly a different kind of process going on to create something in the world that doesn't exist before. And I think it's out of this that Jung's idea of what symbols are begins to emerge. So I want to give a quote from Jung. The symbol is not a sign that disguises something generally known. Its meaning resides in the fact that it's an attempt to elucidate by a more or less apt analogy something that's entirely unknown or still in the process of formation, very much as described. Now, I think if we take this definition, it might give us some clue as to why our ancestors began to paint animals on cave walls. Certainly, I think the first of those date from around 20,000 years ago. But even earlier is this very interesting figure, this lion-headed man, which is actually 35,000 years old, belongs to the Aurignacian period. And what's really interesting, I think, about this is this figure of a lion man, is it's creating an image of something which doesn't ignore is it simply an externalization or projection of something that already exists in the unconscious psyche. The making of a symbolic representation is a creative act, not just making something new in the world, but also making something new in the mind through a process of transformation that is both psychic and physical at once. This particular image suggests that the use of the lion as a symbol is exceedingly ancient. Now, we've got many ideas about what lions might represent: courage, strength, leadership, physical prowess, power, violence, aggression, devouring, lots and lots of things. But there's clearly one thing, there's no one thing to which it can be translated or reduced, and that's what makes it a symbol in Jung's view. Now, I think this is very interesting. This just touches on the issue that Murray was raising in the discussion of Murray Jackson's paper, because there's another paper of mine where it's called The Language of Sexual Metaphor, where I take on this Kleining image of symbols, and I suggest that the problem with it is not that you can't say that the cigar doesn't represent a penis. That's fine. My problem with it is, and I think that Jung talked about this as well, because there's an apocryphal remark of Jung where he said that the penis is a phallic symbol. No, that's not right. Well, do I mean that? Yes, I do mean that. The penis is a phallic symbol. In other words, it is itself, the physical penis is itself a symbol for something. And in that case that Murray talked about, that Murray Jackson described, you can see that, because the question I would want to ask is not just that the cigar represents the penis that he doesn't want to be seen, but what does the penis that he doesn't want to be seen, what does that represent? Right. So again, you've got this idea that a symbol always contains many different meanings and it can't be reduced to any one of them. Now, this makes symbols rather different from words, and there are many different ways of describing this difference, and the one that I like best is the one used by Susanne Langer, which was about 50 years ago. I left that one out, yeah. So, yeah. She makes this distinction between discursive and non-discursive symbols. In discursive symbols, of which words are an example, each element has a discrete meaning or denotation. They're held together, as I said earlier, by a network of grammar and syntax, within which these meanings can be combined into sentences, but each word has a particular meaning that you can take out. Whereas non-discursive symbolism is the kind of symbolism that's used in art and religion and ritual, where the meaning depends on the context. And the meaning is not a single definite thing, but is multiple and indeterminate. It can't be broken down into individual elements. Susanne Langer was very interested in music, which provides an excellent example of this, because the notes in music don't have any meaning on their own. You can't, you can call something an A flat, and that has a meaning, but if you play an A flat, it doesn't have any meaning until it's in a piece of music with lots of other notes, and it's only in the context that it has a meaning which is symbolic in the sense that it clearly refers to something, but it can't be reduced to anything specific. You can interpret music, but you can't reduce it to any one thing. And that's what she means by non-discursive symbolism. I think this distinction has a lot of similarities with Jung's distinction between two different kinds of thinking. This goes back right to his book on the, it was translated as the psychology of the unconscious, and it's now known as Symbols of Transformation. And right at the beginning of that book, which was the book that marked his departure from Freud, Jung makes a distinction between rational, conscious, directed thinking and undirected fantasy thinking. And I think there are a lot of similarities in the kind of distinction that Jung's making and the distinction that Langer makes. And what Jung is beginning to say is that this way of understanding symbols that Freud was using was to treat symbols as if they were discursive symbols like words. Freud was a very, very verbal person. You look at his dreams, you look at that example I talk about in the paper that you may have read. Words always turn up in Freud's dreams, and he makes a lot of plays on words, wonderful, wonderful imaginative things. But it's clear from that that Freud was a very verbal person. And I think it's also obvious that Jung was a much more kind of image, fantasy-based person. You've only got to look at the Red Book to see that. Now, there are many more ways of describing this kind of distinction, and I'm just going to put a slide up here which sort of lists them all. I'm not going to go into all these. It would take all day. But the way so there's some evidence that the right and left brain corresponds to this kind of distinction. But I tend to think that actually that distinction itself in relation to the brain is a metaphorical, symbolic one. It's a rather metaphorical way of looking at the brain, and the reality is much more complicated. But it's interesting that the kind of qualities that are associated with right and left brain tend to again fall out, roughly speaking, into this same kind of distinction. And I've sort of tabulated these out, not in any way to suggest that there's any kind of sameness about these. I'm sure if we went into it, we'd find lots of distinctions between these different kinds of divisions, but it's a sort of, one might say, a sort of, a rough, almost symbolic map of the kind of distinction I'm referring to. Now, I want to go on to say something about the transcendent function, maybe not too much because Murray already talked about that when he talked about the interaction between conscious and unconscious and the way that's required to make a symbol, or to make a symbol meaningful. What I do think is interesting is some of the more recent ways in which people have begun to think about the transcendent function, linking it to new ideas about emergence theory. The idea here is that something that through a process of dialogue and interaction, something emerges which has properties that, again, can't be reduced to the elements out of which it's created. So the meaning of a symbol, and in fact, I thought it was very interesting that Murray said that it's the interaction between the conscious and the symbol that creates the meaning. Because sometimes I've read Jung to suggest that in some way it's the interaction between conscious and unconscious that creates the symbol itself. But either way you look at it, something gets transformed in that process. The symbol takes on another meaning, and it develops a richness that wasn't there before. Now, rather than seeing this as something which simply represents archetypal factors which are there beforehand, I tend to think, and this is what I was getting at with the images like the lion-headed man, is that the creation of symbols actually creates the meaning, and that in a sense has a kind of retroactive effect back on the unconscious, so that we might say that in a sense symbols create the archetypes, or at least they have an influence back on the archetypes, and in that way our archetypal life is also developing as well as our symbolic life. So part of the purpose of symbols is actually to refashion our own unconscious, our own being in the world. This can also be thought about in terms of the development of complex networks. And this picks up the theme I mentioned earlier about language as a network. Both of Jung's methods for developing the transcendent function, Murray mentioned amplification using symbolic parallels from mythology. There's also active imagination, which is to do with the work of focusing on the image and allowing it to develop in its own way. This is part of the way of thinking about the image that Jung sometimes calls dreaming the dream onwards. Both of these methods foster the development of complex networks of association. And that's what dreams do as well. In other words, dreams use a form of thinking unlike verbal language, which is network thinking, where in network thinking, like this non-discursive symbolism or music, all the elements of the network are potentially present at once. So the apprehension, understanding of the network requires thinking tools that act as network hubs in which many lines in the network converge. In short, symbols. So the symbols act as the hub through which you can get a sense of all the different associations that are combined in that network. And it's not a fixed network. I think you can see this in the way, this is why I like Freud's way of interpreting dreams. I'm not particularly interested in his conclusions, but I like the method because his own associations and his capacity for associations is so rich and multiple that you get a sense of a sort of infinite web of associations that are operating in the unconscious. There's no absolute endpoint. Jung does the same sort of thing, but in a very different way, because rather than looking at unconscious personal associations, he looks at collective mythological interpretations. But likewise, there's no absolute endpoint to that. You can always draw in more associations, more analogies into the network. But there are key points in the network, and the more associations you bring in, the more powerful the meaning of the central hub, symbolic hub is. So the implication here is that symbols function as a way of processing and integrating new information in terms of existing networks. Another way of putting it would be that symbolic networks provide a sense of meaning and purpose that enable us to function more successfully in the world. And that's why dreaming and thinking about dreams promotes the therapeutic process. And this is also associated with what the psychoanalyst Winnicott talked about, the capacity to play. He talks about this as something that's going on in children's play, where they're working out various things through the objects that they use in their play. But he also talked about play as something that's very important in the therapeutic process. Now, unlike scientific facts and theories, whose validity tends to decrease to the extent that they're ambiguous or susceptible to multiple interpretations, the point about symbols is that their value increases the more multiple and indeterminate the interpretations are. Consider, for example, the ambiguity and inherent uncertainty of great works of art such as Hamlet or the Mona Lisa. It's their very quality of uncertainty that attracts more and more meanings, more and more interpretations, and the meaning and the significance grows because of that. They can't be pinned down. In the therapeutic setting, this can be compared with negative capability. This is a term that the poet John Keats used, and he defined it as the capacity for being in uncertainties, mysteries and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And this was taken up by the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion as the state of mind needed by the analyst in being in a suitable state of mind to be able to make meaning out of the patient's communications. Whereas John Keats was referring to it as the capacity needed for the poet to allow images to develop and unfold in the mind. And again, this is, I think, very similar to what Jung had in mind by the work of active imagination. So it seems that the poet and the analyst need to cultivate this mental faculty in order to learn to speak and interpret the natural unconscious language of dreams. In both cases, it required the development of a state of mind that partakes both of waking and sleeping consciousness. So ordinary waking consciousness, the rational mind, has to be suppressed to the extent that it can allow the more kind of unconscious, associative, metaphorical play on images and words to develop. But at the same time, there has to be a conscious element that keeps going on to be able to assess and evaluate those associations and turn them into useful thoughts that can be offered to the patient. Sometimes I have the experience when I'm working with patients, quite frustrating. If I get too deep into the reverie, I'm sort of aware that I'm having some very interesting associations, but as soon as I become aware of them, I come back up into a more rational state of mind, and I've lost them. It's actually quite tricky to get that balance just right. And I think it's a similar sort of thing with poetry. Some people are very, very good at the associative images They can link things together in a wonderful way, but they produce poetry that's incoherent. It's not sufficiently ordered. Other people may be too ordered, too rational, and then the more kind of alive, symbolic, metaphorical, associative element doesn't get enough space. Now, I'm looking at the time. I'm not sure how much time I've actually got. I wanted to go on to give an example of a dream. Have I got time for that, or should I?
Yeah, I think we're doing good on time if you want to proceed with that.
Okay. This is a dream that I think provides a very good example of a dream with a central symbol that kind of attracts all the various meanings in it. And it's a very numinous symbol. The dreamer was a young man in his late 20s, and he was one of my first analytic patients a number of years ago. The dream marked a watershed in his life and his inner analysis because it constellated an emerging sense of individuality and selfhood. He'd recently got married, and he was just embarked on what would turn out to be a very successful academic career. In the dream, there's an interweaving of his own individuation with a very strong father transference to me as a kind of psychopomp, a guide and mentor leading him into the world of his future career that he would eventually make his own. So I'm going to tell the dream as he told it to me. So in the account I'm going to give the dreamer as the I, and I'm the person he refers to as you. So this is what he told me. He says, I was going to a lecture that you were going to give and saw you strolling past a tennis court on your way to the lecture. There's a small boy, about 7 years old, comes out from the tennis court and falls over in front of you and grazes his knee. You help him up and you take care of him. And then you give him a picture card with a mountain on it and a sort of big stone. I then go up to the boy, and the boy gives me the stone. It's a large stone. It's broken into two halves, and on each of the four faces there's a spiral. I'll show you a picture of this now. This is the drawing he made, or it's a copy of the drawing he made of the stone. So the idea is this is a stone that's sort of this sort of shape, and this picture shows the sort of one of the back halves and the inner face, which is flat, and then there's another half, so the stone opens like this. And I'll show you the other half in a minute. So then in the second part of the dream, we're in the lecture, and you're telling us about your experience with the boy. You said that you tried to approach the situation as it was, apart from its Oxfordness. He then explained that Oxfordness referred to all the assumptions of social and cultural reality that Jung would call the collective consciousness. But I was angry, he said, and I challenged you, insisting that Oxfordness is an inherent part of experience and cannot be separated from it. It's not possible to experience the world without socially conditioned assumptions. You can see why this chap went on to become an academic. These are the sorts of thoughts he has in his dreams. He said, I then produced the stone in the lecture. It's a sort of coup that trumps your argument. So you can see already there's a very interesting mixture here between something very, very academic and intellectual and rational and the use of this powerful image. But it's the powerful image, he says, that trumps the argument. So he drew the images of the stone, and he brought the drawing. During the analysis, he brought the drawings to show me, but it was much later on in the analysis, after we talked about it, that he very kindly brought photocopies of the drawings for me, and it's these that I've got here. Now, that's one half of the stone, and here's the other half of the stone, which I'm going to go on and talk a bit more about. There was a very dense web of significant meanings in the dream, but there was only one personal association. This referred to an actual incident in his childhood with his father. So he remembered he would have been about 3 or 4 years old, just learning to ride a tricycle, and he was outside of the outside of the house and fell off the bike and grazed his knee, started crying, and his father came out and picked him up. He said this was a rare moment of closeness with a father who was usually much more distant. The first thing I want to mention is that the way this dream could be thought of, perhaps in a rather Freudian sense, as having very strong Oedipal elements. This thing on the it's on the left with the like a sort of red hand, he also associated with a placenta, and it would also be very easy to see the tightly coiled spiral as representing a vagina. So in that sense, the stone could be seen as representing the feminine, the mother, and an Oedipal wish to steal the mother from the father and triumph over him in that way. And that was clearly one element in the dream. But there's also another way of looking at this tightly coiled spiral that seemed much more alive in the analysis, that, if you like, attracted much more kind of symbolic resonance. If you look at it more closely, you can see that the other thing it looks very much like is a fingerprint. So in that sense, the stone represents the patient's essential identity, his imprint, the thing that's imprinted on him and that he wished to imprint on the world. It was represented at that point by me, his analyst. Coming as it did at the point of making an important step in his career, it indicated his ambition to make his mark in the world, again initially represented by making his mark on me and in the analysis, but having much wider ramifications. And as I said, he has indeed gone on to make a very successful career and make quite a mark in his chosen field. The idea of the imprint also leads back to the idea of Oxfordness. How far do we shape our own destiny, and how far is it imprinted on us? Furthermore, how far is it possible to free ourselves from social conditioning and discover what might be called the essential self? Because in this sense, the dream image of the stone is clearly a symbol of the self. I think stones often do have this kind of symbolic meaning. And this symbol emerges out of a host of complex issues which are also represented in the dreams, that were constellated in the patient's life and analysis at that time, and in some ways remain apparent in the interest that he subsequently pursued. There's a conflict here between thinking and feeling. I referred to that earlier, that there's this very kind of academic idea represented by Oxfordness, but there's something very feeling in the way that he uses the stone and the way the stone is associated with a very feelingful memory about his relationship with his father. There's also a very interesting association to the tennis court. You remember he was walking past the tennis court, or I was walking past the tennis court. There was a tennis court that he passed on his way to my consulting room, which was one image. But more evocatively, it reminded him of the film Blow Up, in which there's a tennis court that I think it comes up at the beginning and the end of the film. There's a group of strangely dressed people who are playing mime tennis. They're playing as if there's a ball, but there isn't really a ball. You can just about sort of see one of these mime figures. His interest in this film had to do with the preoccupation with appearance and reality. What was real, you see? What was the fundamental reality? And I think for him, the idea of the stone represented something that was fundamentally real and had to do with establishing his true self beyond appearance. Because what happens in this tennis game is that these figures, the sort of main figure, the hero of the film, who's a photographer, and there's a whole issue about appearance and reality in the film. He's walking past the tennis court, as myself and the patient were in the dream, and somebody throws or hits the ball, this imaginary ball, and the figure who knows it's an imaginary ball has the choice about whether he's going to pick it up or not. And in fact, he does. He picks up the imaginary ball and throws it back. He joins in the imaginary game. The final thing I want to say is the conflict that's going on here in both in his internal world and actually his external world, in the conflict with his father, and also being worked out in the transference with me. And again, I'd want to say that all these areas have equal meaning and value. It's not a question of reducing any one of them to any of the others. The father analyst of the dream is a loved and admired figure, a guide and a mentor, but also a rival and competitor who's felt to be imposing his view of the world and trying to make him over in his own image. So the stone offers a potential resolution of this conflict by representing the self as a complexio oppositorum. It's a symbol which links together all these various themes. It doesn't so much unite them as it offers a sort of placeholder for them. It provides a symbolic focus that contains them all within the patient's emergent sense of having his own unique identity, represented by the fingerprint. And in this way, it takes him beyond the adolescent conflict with the father towards his own unique individuation. It remained a very crucial element in the analysis, and I expect the sort of dream that would remain with him for the rest of his life. So I shall stop there.
This comes from a student at ISAP. Anne, do you want to ask the question?
Yes, thank you. And we have mentioned about the use of symbols in our life, in our culture. And would you please also give us some examples of the misuse of symbols? Thank you.
Did you hear that, Steve? Use and misuse of symbols. This was
came across well.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just start that by saying that symbols, we're talking now about cultural symbols. These are symbols, images that capture strong feeling, emotion, a response on a cultural level. And we have many examples of that. If you wave a flag, you sing the Star Spangled Banner in the United States, or national anthem, or hockey team's insignia and so on, you get a very strong emotional response, and people cheering and shouting or booing and screaming. And it's visceral. And so collective symbols have a way of capturing collective libido, collective energy, and directing it in a certain way. And politicians know all about this, advertisers know all about it, and they pitch their messages accordingly so that they will get the response that they're looking for. Vote for me, buy my product, so on and so forth. And Jung has written about the danger of collective symbols. I mean, usually he's quite positive about it when he talks about religious symbols and meaning and so on, and how they can give meaning. On the other hand, they can be used for very destructive purposes. And when he was observing what was going on in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, there was a tremendous use of symbolism on the part of the National Socialist Party and Hitler's party. Ritual, marching, light effects, all kinds of symbolic activities going on that galvanized the collective psyche of the nation and directed it in his direction. And he put himself in front of it and said he's the leader, he's the savior, the Führer, and so on, so forth. So you can see how symbols can affect the human psyche on a collective level and can be used for ulterior motives and purposes. And of course, religions do this too. People who are very skeptical about the motives of priests, for instance, they are suspicious that priests are using their symbolic craft and power in a way that keeps them in the positions that they've arrived at, positions of authority, that they can extort gold to build their temples from poor populations, so on and so forth. And that the people who donate to these causes do it with great enthusiasm and great meaning, and are taken in by it. So there's a dark, shadowy side to the use of symbols, and we could say the misuse of symbols. It's an ethical question, how you use your symbolic power. If you have a position, you're a celebrity, for instance, you have a lot of symbolic power. You mean something to people's unconscious. You stand up there as a beautiful celebrity, an actor, actress, athlete, something like that, and you say a few words and you smile. You have a tremendous influence on people because that resonates with something in their psyche, something profound and archetypal. You're a hero figure, you're a goddess, you're a mythological being. And so ethics comes very much into play when you talk about the use of symbols. And I think we have to be very aware as political and cultural people who participate in collective situations, how we use our own powers to create symbols and use them or misuse them, or see through how others are using or misusing theirs. It's a very, very tricky business. And I'd like to hear Warren say something about that.
Yeah, I was thinking about the relation between symbols and images. I think it was picking up from what you said about politics and advertising, because it seems to me that the use of symbolic material in these contexts tends to quite quickly denude symbols of their meaning, because people start seeing through them. So I think that contributes to living in a culture which has a multiplicity of images, but not so much symbolic power. And another example of that, of course, would be the internet, because the massive availability of multiple imagery on the internet means that people can take their pick. And this kind of process I'm talking about, whereby a lot of meanings get associated with a sort of central hub, is less likely to happen for good or ill. Both, actually. It means that symbols are less likely to be misused, but I think it also reduces the power that symbols have as a kind of collective glue for people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. Well,
thank you. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go to Asheville. Are there any questions here? Yep, go ahead. Well, wait, before you do, push the green light on. There you go.
Okay. So there's a question about something Murray was explaining. So if living a personal versus a symbolic life is banal and gives rise to a kind of a desperation that results in projections onto ideologies and leaders, and yet fully understanding a symbol in the way that Jung understood Catholicism can strip from it its life and power, what's the right balance of inquiry, I guess, that creates a symbolic and meaningful life?
Could you hear the question?
I could hear the question. Now, I'm just trying to see if I understand it. What is the right balance? I think that what Warren says is very interesting about the loss of the power of symbols in modern times, because people see through them, and once a symbol is seen through, once you understand it, once it or you see how it's being used or misused, you become suspicious of it and walk away from it. You're left with this problem. Okay. If you step outside of the collective and the collective sources of symbolic imagery and symbolic meanings, this is the kind of person that Jung is addressing as modern man in search of his soul. I'm getting an echo again, Steve.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll pass that along. Somebody should take care of that shortly.
The modernity, as Jung understood it, is a culture that's utilitarian. It's practical. It's technological. It's scientific, but it's flat, flat of meaning, devoid of symbolic meaning. And so people either go back into or try to go back into traditional religions for their symbolic nourishment, let's say, and if that works, that's fine, and that's one explanation for why fundamentalism is such a powerful force in the modern world. That there has been people have tasted of modernity and see that it's empty and lacking and it's flat, and so they look elsewhere and they fall back to resources that were available in earlier generations. So there's a kind of regression back to what Jung would call a mythological age. But for some people, that isn't an alternative. So they're stuck with this flat culture. They can't go back into the mythological that has been offered by the traditional religions and cultures. They can't become primitive. So what do? And here Jung offered a way to another resource for symbolic meaning, and that was to go inward, to look at your dreams, to look at your active imagination, or perhaps to look carefully at where you are moved in your environment, in nature, to enter into a kind of deep reverie, as Warren was talking about, with your environment, with the world around you. And maybe you can connect to some symbolic meanings or resources that way. And some people have gone, ecology, for instance, is the Gaia principle is potentially a new religion, a new symbol system, that the earth breathes, the earth is alive, the earth is suffering, the earth is speaking to us. We're going to do a future seminar with an ecologist, psychological ecologist, who will speak very strongly about how to read the earth's language, speaking back to us. We have to engage in a dialogue with the earth. Well, that's a kind of mythological perception of nature that can be used as an alternative to this flatness of modern culture that looks like nothing but technology. Jung's idea was that if we go inward to the nuclear core and observe it, you aren't going to get a big dream every night, thank goodness. You couldn't handle it, you couldn't stand it. But maybe in the course of your lifetime, you'll get 3 or 4. And if you really work with them and you hold them close to you and you continue associating to them and building out this network that Warren was talking about, a network of associations, this can really nourish you. It can guide you. It can contain your psyche. It can direct you and give you meaning, feeling of belonging to something greater. So it's a kind of personal symbolic life. Now, how to get the balance, how far to go with that, is a very personal question. At some stages of life, it's better not to have too much of it. You know, you need to be practical. You need to get a job. You need to support a family. You need to build a career. These are all very practical things. You need to adapt, go study, do all that culture requires in order to become a productive member. Other times in your life history, it might be better to look more to the symbolic, to go deeper into that nuclear core, to live with the symbols and let them suggest directions for your energy, where you don't have to be as engaged in the practical. And I'm thinking now of people in retirement or who are getting older. Somebody told me there are books being written now on aging as a spiritual practice. Very good idea, but how do you do it? How do you make aging into a spiritual practice? I would say it'd be rather flat if all you do is go to the doctor and the dentist and check your insurance policies every day to be sure you're covered. I mean, that's not a spiritual practice. You're aging, but how to make it into a spiritual practice, that's a whole different thing. That means you have to have access to the spiritual. And Jung would say, you're a prime candidate for dream work, individuation, active imagination. That's what that work is all about in the second half of life. And there you can tilt more in the direction. The balance shifts in the direction of meditation, contemplation, more the feeling intuitive side rather than the practical adaptive side of your life. Maybe Warren could say something about this too.
Well, I certainly agree with what you're saying about personal meaning, and I think this is one of the central things about Jung's ideas about individuation, is this idea that collective meaning systems often aren't working for people. But I think that the variety of the way that people find personal meaning is very interesting. And one of the things that came to mind, which I think very interestingly shows the kind of link between technological consciousness and personal meaning is an account I read by a scientist, an applied mathematician, somebody called Stephen Strogatz. He works in the area of synchronization. So I read his book recently because I wanted to see what he had to say about synchronicity, which was more or less nothing. But anyway, he's done some very interesting work, very to do with mathematical modeling. He's done some of the work on small world networks and understanding how things like fireflies flash off and off in unison as a kind of emergent phenomenon. But the thing that it reminded me of was that he describes a moment, he was about 15, when they were studying pendulums in physics, and they were asked to note down what was happening and to create a graph of the pendulums. And as he did so, he recognized that what he was seeing linked up, in fact, was the same as the mathematical equations he'd been studying in algebra. And he says at that moment he had a moment of awe and terror as he realized this underlying meaning in the universe. And you can see that for him at this moment, this was a numinous experience of meaning, this understanding of the way that things link up and the significance of mathematics. And this is somebody who's then gone on and spent his whole life working on the processes that underlie synchronization. He talks a lot about pendulums, and the theme of the pendulum comes up again and again in this very, very complex scientific work. And so I think you can see that often people, and I think it's true for us as analysts in a very different way, that we find meaning in our work and in productive activity. So it's not necessarily the case that because something is technological or scientific, it has no soul. It depends on who it has soul for. And I think there are a number of accounts like this from scientists who find numinous meaning in the work they're doing. And the crucial thing, it seems to me, is that people have meaning and purpose. And this seems to be a very good example of it.
Well, that's a wonderful example. I'm thinking of Pauli, some of Pauli's imagery of the world clock and so on. I think particular kinds of minds find science and mathematics utterly, mystical. And I think Einstein was another one. He had a sort of feeling for the way nature is put together, and it's beyond the rational. So it becomes symbolic. It taps into networks of meaning, suggests something, invisible laws that are the harmony of the spheres and so on. But actually, I thought, Warren, you were going to start talking about film, because I know you're very interested in film as a resource for symbols in modern times. Do you want to say anything about that? Or not even limit yourself only to film, but to modern culture, which is also rich in possibilities for us to find individually, maybe make a selection of things that really speak to us, images.
Well, I think there are, trying to think about it, I'm not sure, actually, because in a way I had film in the back of my mind when I was talking about the way in which images lose their symbolic meaning. I think it may be becoming more difficult for film to carry strong symbolic force. It may be maybe just a matter of things change from time to time. You may be thinking of the interest I had in the Matrix some years ago.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
There certainly did seem to be a crop of films around that time, which were all about the gap between appearance and reality, and the idea of artificial worlds and trying to find meaning in a mechanized world, and that seemed to sort of tap an image somewhere. And it's quite interesting to think that actually those films were being made around the time of the millennium. Maybe that had something to do with it. But of course, the thing that came straight after the millennium was 9/11. And I mean, this is very, very speculative, but I wonder whether that is such a kind of massively disruptive event that we haven't really yet found ways of symbolizing it. And my sense, and again, it's a very speculative, and I'm not sure I'd want to be held to it, but my sense is that what seems to be going on in film and the arts at the moment seems to be much more kind of immediate sensation-based, and I'm not sure there's much around, at least I'm aware of at the moment, that has that kind of depth of meaning, at least in the mass culture. Of course, there are always art films and so on that do, but I'm trying to think about the way that, you know, you can use things like, you know, the popular arts as a kind of litmus of what might be going on collectively for people.
Well, thank you. Question for you, Warren. Do you have an audience there at all? Is anybody there that would like to ask a question, or is it just you and there?
Just me and my technician.
Yeah. Okay. Does your technician have a question? What's for lunch, right? Or dinner?
A technical question.
Right. Okay. Let's take an email question, and then we'll keep going. First, let me ask though, Murray and Warren, my assumption is that we've covered the formal presentation and the remaining time we're able to use for questions. Is that accurate, or do I need to hold any time for any specific presentations left?
That's certainly true for me.
Yeah, good. Okay. You too, Murray?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Good. Mm-hmm. Good. Well, let's go. Let me ask an email question or two, and then we can see again with Asheville and I'm sorry, and then the other side, Asheville and Zurich, where they want questions. First question I'd like to pose is really for both presenters, which is, could you contrast the differences between the two schools of thought, between Zurich and London, of how symbolic meaning is used in a Jungian analytical approach? I guess we could ask both, but can you speak more to maybe the differences between the two schools of thought there?
Well, that was one of the reasons I wanted to ask Warren to join us in this seminar, because traditionally Zurich and London have been, you could say, the antipodes of the Jungian world, the poles, in the sense that Zurich, built around Jung and the first generation of Jungians after him here, had a certain view of the psyche and symbols and individuation and how one works in analysis using dreams, active imagination, relatively small emphasis on transference, face-to-face, twice a week, so on and so forth. It was a particular style of analysis that developed in Jung's time and continues to some extent to this day. It's called the classical school in Andrew Samuel's nomenclature that he came up with in his book some years ago about schools of Jungian thought. Whereas in London, what developed was what he calls a developmental school, and much more emphasis on early childhood in analysis on transference interpretation. And Murray Jackson's paper, I think, represented a certain stage in the development of the developmental school, where heavy borrowings were made from the current psychoanalytic thinkers of that time, not so much Freud, but object relations theorists, the London theorists, Kleinians, Winnicott, Fairbairn. When you read Murray Jackson's paper, you can see a host of references to the people who were then very active, Winnicott, so on and so forth. And to this day, I would say that in the papers that are written by people who train in London, you'll get more references to those sources, whereas in Zurich, you get more references to people who lived and trained or worked in Zurich or closely with that early generation of Jungian analysts. So to some extent, this difference remains, but I would say today it's much less sharp and antagonistic and strained than it was back when Murray Jackson wrote that paper in the early 1960s. I would say through the 1970s and 80s even, the Journal of Analytical Psychology was very heavily Kleinian in its orientation. Some people said more Kleinian than the Kleinians. That changed in the late 80s when John Beebe came on board as the American editor of the journal, and has continued to shift. And with Warren, I think it's been very balanced between the developmental and the classical schools. Warren likes diversity. As editor, he's been very generous with all schools who've come up with good quality papers and has published them. He also included them in his conferences. So the edge has gone off a good deal. But I would still like to engage Warren a little bit on the topic, what are the differences? And are they receding, or are they going to stay more or less put with where they are today? When I read Warren's paper, I still hear echoes of, I would say, the developmental school, but much less strong echoes. But for instance, if a Jungian from Zurich looked at Freud's dream and picked it up to do a reinterpretation of it from a classical Jungian point of view, they'd come up with other kinds of amplifications and associations than Warren does. I think looking at plants, for instance, looking at flowers as symbols. Freud has a dream in which he has just written a botanical essay on some subject, and there are dead leaves placed in each of the volumes, each of the copies, and he's very pleased that he's been able to write this book. A classical Jungian might see it as a self symbol representing some kind of wholeness, that the plant is a Urpflanz, as Goethe would have written about, a primal form, an image that suggests life and growth. But why is it dead in Freud's book, he would ask? Questions like that. I think one would have a different kind of paper than Warren has written. I love Warren's writings, and he's very suggestive and careful and interesting. Very good writer. I still see the tendency a bit to maybe take the object relations in his references, the object relations, Winnicott, beyond, so on, reverie as coming out of beyond, so on. There. So maybe it's a different network of associations these days. Training is a little bit different. London, I think they still generally train people to work 4 times a week. Maybe not so many of them do anymore once they're finished training. But on the couch, transference analysis, so on. The Jungians in Zurich have gone that way a good distance. We have courses at ISEP in developmental psychology now. We do include in our teaching references to modern psychoanalysis. We do look at transference much more than was true in earlier years when I trained here 30, 40 years ago. So I think we've moved in the direction of London. Maybe London's moved somewhat in the direction of Zurich. But I'd like to hear Warren's reflections on this as well.
Well, there are very real differences, as you say, in a different way. I was still drawing on Freud's way of gathering associations, which was primarily personal. There's also more of an emphasis on the transference. I think possibly more of an emphasis on therapeutic neutrality, which tends to go with working with the transference and being abstemious about the additional material that one might bring in, and that might include collective associations, unless there's a very strong sense that this is directly relevant to what the patient's about. So there's less emphasis on Jung's way of thinking was I think to try and actually link people up to collective themes and to help them find meaning in collective schemas. Whereas I think in a way in the developmental school it's kind of the other way around. in that what collective material is used is kind of fed back into the more personal story that I would say the patient and analyst are building up together. The other thing I want to say, though, which is to do with perhaps the coming together and the less antagonistic view, is that there have been elements in the London School which have been a bit different from that. Yes, there's always been an emphasis on object relations and references to psychoanalysis, but as a favourite paper of mine called Transference as a Form of Active Imagination, that was written in the 1960s by Dorothy Davidson, who was a child analyst. And this is very much at the height of the Klein-Jung hybrid. And she was talking about the way that transference could be understood as a form of active imagination, only with the idea that instead of the patient having the associations and dreaming the dream onward, this is something that the analyst needs to do themselves. And that the active imagination is the unconscious drama that's being worked out. I think one of the things that's very helpful about that way of working is it enables one to use this kind of way of thinking, this symbolic way of thinking, and is what I refer to as reverie. And I think this is a concept from psychoanalysis, but as I said, I think it's very closely connected with what Jung is talking about. It enables us to use that way of thinking with patients who are not really able, willing, or interested to engage in things like active imagination, and may indeed not bring dreams very much. I think this was one of the problems that the London analysts faced, that they were faced with patients who just didn't seem to conform to what they expected of patients, given the sort of things that Jung had written about. There's another example of that Michael Fordham gives, where he talks about, because he actually made the transition from starting out in the 1940s and 50s working in a classical way, using active imagination. And one of the things he discovered was that a lot of the patients who were using active imagination with him turned out to have very powerful transferences to him. They were in love with him. And actually, what the active imagination turned out to be something that they were just going along with because Michael wanted it. And I think when you read these papers, you get the sense that actually he was quite sort of shocked when he realized this. And it was experiences like this that led him to pay more attention to transference. I think one of the other ways that the differences have softened, and this certainly is true for me, is that I've come to feel that the kind of theories we hold are all rather relative. So that my interest is in the use of symbolic thinking, the capacity to link things together, to help people to think in a broader symbolic, metaphorical way, to use that way of thinking to find meaning in the things that they bring to their therapy. But actually, the system of meaning that the therapist happens to hold seems to me to be less central. And that, I think, is connected with my interest in diversity that you were talking about. It means that I'm not necessarily, as editor of the journal, looking for one particular system of theoretical meaning. And you can see that all these things are shifting anyway. The Kleinians didn't think the way that Freud thought, but if you look at the Kleinians now, actually they don't think the way that Melanie Klein thought either. So all these things, I think, do soften and shift over a period of time, and there is no one true way. And I think this was a problem in the past. I think possibly both schools, all schools actually, tended to have this idea that we were going to be, we either were or were about to become in possession of the truth. And after, I think, our field as a whole, depth psychology, I think, is the broad term that Andrew Samuels uses, after it's been around for 100 years, I think we can see that that's not really the case, that there are actually a lot of different meaning systems out there, and they seem to be equally effective with patients, as long as basic things are paid attention to, which then puts the emphasis quite differently, not on the theoretical system or the system of symbolic meaning, but on the quality of the relatedness. And this is one of the things that my colleague Jean Knox talks a lot about. She says, that it doesn't really matter what theory the analyst holds. What matters is whether or not and how they're relating to the patient. And this links up with some of the ideas coming out of the intersubjective schools about attunement and intersubjectivity. And these new ideas, I think, run across all the different therapeutic schools, and they have the potential to be a unifying factor.
Great. Well, thank you.
I think that if I could just keep this going for a moment.
Marie, let me interrupt just for a second. Can you move a foot to the right? You're a little bit off our camera line. That's perfect. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry,
not you, Warren. Just I know London sometimes drives on the other side of the road, but we're set now.
That better?
You stay on the left, Warren. I wanted to pick up on something you touched on toward the end of your comments, and that is the generation of symbolic material out of the interactive field, the interpersonal field of analysis. And in this intersubjective movement that quite a few of our Jungian colleagues are also involved in, and importantly, I think Andrew Samuels, for instance, has been since the beginning of it and continues to be very involved in it. Also, some of our American colleagues. The idea is that in that field, which Jung also wrote about in his essay on the psychology of the transference, the bath, and in the bath, the interaction between the two psyches at the conscious and unconscious levels can produce powerful symbols that come out of the relationship, perhaps show themselves in dreams, perhaps in moments of reverie and exchange or amplification. And a paper that Linda Carter wrote for Jungian psychoanalysis that Warren wrote for as well, she gives an example of a moment of meeting, as she calls it, a current term in the field, a moment of meeting that occurred in a kind of reverie state where she was interacting with a patient who was in a difficult spot, and he gave his narrative account of something that happened, and she amplified it with a story that came to her mind from classical Greek mythology, actually. And in this moment, they had an extraordinary sense of meeting and understanding and sharing, and that moment really impressed me as something that does happen in analysis and remains a kind of milestone in the analytic process, where you have these moments where imagery is an important part of it, but feeling enters, and you have the sense of a presence of something greater between you. You mentioned that, Warren, that there's an invisible friend in the room with you. There is, you could say, a symbolic moment. Would you comment on that, Warren?
Are you referring to where I talk about the unconscious ally?
Yes. I think is that the phrase you use, unconscious ally?
I'm not sure. I do talk about unconscious ally. I'm not sure if it's in that paper. While you're looking for it, I'll talk about the unconscious ally.
Yeah. All right.
Which is that.
Yes, unconscious ally. Exactly.
Yeah, it's to do with the way that you can't necessarily tell conscious interaction whether there's a process going on or not. This is particularly important when you work in areas where there's a lot of negative transference, because some of these patients, they come along week after week, year after year, and they tell you how much they hate you and how much the analysis is not doing them any good. And yet, actually, they still keep coming, and over time, you can see that actually they're getting quite a lot from it, and they're growing and becoming more substantial, and things are making more sense to them. On the other hand, you get patients who come along, and I had one some years ago from whom I learned a great deal, a patient who was absolutely keen as mustard, to use an English phrase, very enthusiastic. And She wanted to come as often as possible, so we came working up to 4 times a week very quickly, and on the couch she went and did all the right things. And after a few months, she started missing sessions and became more and more irregular in her attendance. And I came to realize that actually there was no unconscious ally, that what I was actually getting was something that was entirely on the surface, entirely conscious. And after not too long, actually, the therapy just fell apart altogether and she left. And I felt that I had failed with her, as indeed I had. But I learned a lot from it, because it showed me, it gave me an experience of how important the unconscious interaction is. And of course, this is so much what Jung talks about in the psychology of the transference, with that famous diagram of his, where you have the different cross-connections between conscious and unconscious, and that terribly important one at the bottom, where there's a connection, a relationship going on between patient and analyst, which is between unconscious and unconscious. And the fascinating thing about this is that although a lot of things come out of that field in the form of symbols, and indeed the way that the transference develops, actually there are some things that never come out of that field. Actually, there are transformative processes going on that I think that you never really know how they happen or understand them. And what I think of, or at least an important component of what I think of as the analytic attitude, is being open to that, having a sort of ear to that area that you don't know and don't understand, which again is a very difficult thing to do, because it's, I suppose it being confusing, it's, well, it's just more comfortable to be with the known sometimes.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Want to ask some email questions. There are a number out there. There's also, of course, our 2 audiences. Let me ask one more email question, then we'll cycle back to Zurich and Asheville if there's local questions, and then certainly there's a number of email questions further if there's time for those as well. Next question, if possible. In December 2012, the Mayan calendar suggests that the world will end. Do you have a sense of the symbolic nature of this prediction, or any other thoughts along those lines about it? And that could be for either presenter.
Well, I'll hear Warren on this as well. Human beings have this, in addition to symbolic animals, have an awareness of endings. You don't have to get too old before you realize that you're going to die. And so we have a sense of beginnings and endings. And beginnings and endings have a tremendous significance in our lives. We begin at birth with a birth trauma or birth experience coming through a canal, or however we're born, and we come into this world, and we go out of this world. So we know this. Everything has a beginning. The universe has a beginning. Presumably it will have an end. This planet had a beginning. It will have an end. The sun had a beginning. It will have an end. We know this. And we know it's going to be a huge event when it happens. So in the Bible, for instance, there is a beginning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The book of Revelation, there is an end. It's the end of the world. The New Jerusalem descends on the planet into the cosmos. You have a beginning and you have an end. So we look at history and we say, will there be an end? When is there going to be an end? And there have been many ends. There have been many ends projected in history. Every millennium is going to be the end of the world. People thought it would happen the year 2000. It's predictable that somebody's going to come up with the notion that it's going to happen on a certain day. Now it's December 12th, 2012, because I guess a Mayan calendar predicted that. And so when you come to these moments of perception of an ending, you get massive projections going on. What's going to happen after the end? Should we prepare for the end? So it's like we're preparing for the end of our own individual lives. We're preparing for the end of the world. And I think it constellates a lot of fantasy, a lot of imagery, a lot of symbolism, apocalyptic symbolism. Some years ago, just before his death, his last book, Edward Edinger wrote a book called Apocalypse. And he examined a lot of myths about the apocalypse and, catastrophic imagery and so on and so forth. I can recommend that book as very good reading on the subject. And Joseph Redfern, who was a long-standing analyst at the SAP in London, I'm sure Warren knew him well, just died last week at the age of 90-something. He came to the United States back in the 1980s, and I met him at a Ghost Ranch conference, and he gave a lecture on it, dreams of atomic bombs, atomic warfare. And he had the idea that when patients dreamt about atomic explosions, it was a very good moment in the analysis, because it meant, for him, it was a symbol of the self. And the ending was the ending of something that needed to end. It would be the beginning of something else. It was a catastrophe in one sense, an ego death. But it would open up to a greater kind of awareness, a new heaven and a new earth, if you will, a symbolic awareness after the event. He wrote a paper on that, and I was very impressed with his observation. I don't see so many dreams about atomic bombs anymore, atomic warfare in those days, but this end of the world prediction, I'm sure will capture a lot of fantasy and projection and symbolic material. Warren, what's your take on it?
Well, I was thinking about, I mean, this is something that occurs from time to time. There was actually one quite recently, wasn't there, a couple of months ago? Somebody from the Rapture group predicted the end of the world in time in May and said that he wouldn't be giving any interviews afterwards.
Yes.
So I think what strikes me about this sort of thing is that I think it's an example of concretization of symbolic ideas. Another example of that would be when Dan Brown's book about the Holy Grail came out. People started running around Europe looking for it, which seems to me a good example of people not really quite grasping what a symbol actually is, that it's not, it may be represented by an object, but something like the Holy Grail is almost like a field of symbolic meaning. There isn't actually a concrete thing, some concrete cup somewhere that actually is the Holy Grail. So I then sort of wonder, well, what sort of fantasies would people be having to concretize that in the form of the end of the world? And the nearest thing that I can think about, it seems to me to be a rather pessimistic state of mind. I'm not sure it is quite the sort of, hasn't quite got the kind of life and energy of Joe Redfern's ideas about atomic bombs, and he talks about it as the exploding self. So I was thinking about a patient of mine who gets into very pessimistic states where he does feel that the world is going to rack and ruin in one way and another, and he's convinced that everything is going on for the worst. And the work is about trying to recognize what the personal meaning of that is to him, but almost more is about trying to recognize that these states of mind they can get very fixed, so that people get into them and they can't get out of them, and it takes on a kind of a reality that sort of takes over, rather than it being a way you might feel one day and you wake up the next day and you feel better. So I would think about it as the concretization of a state of mind that has not been able to become properly symbolic.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think that raises the issue in a very sharp way. What is it to be symbolic? What is a symbolic attitude? And it is not concrete, but it does need objects. And this is I think Murray Jackson was working on that too. And the cigar is no longer a substitute for the penis. Oh, and what is the penis a symbol of? And there is an object of fascination that is the carrier of projection and elicits and draws projections. And you can't have the symbol without the object, but you don't want to say that the object is the symbol. I mean, this is the paradox we're working with.
Yeah, so there has to be an openness, there has to be a space between the symbol and what it means, and I think it also has to be fluid. Something happens when a symbol gets fixed, and I think that's the problem with the kind of interpretation that Murray Jackson and the Kleinians were making, that they got too fixed an idea of what a symbol was, that a symbol, one thing represents another. But actually what was going on in Kleinian psychoanalysis is all these apparently very basic body parts they were talking about, penis and breasts and vaginas and so on, were all the time developing more and more symbolic meaning because of the way that people were writing about them. Yes. So, it's sort of the thing that the symbol represents is always escaping from the symbol, and what happens when they get concretized is like people try and fix the meaning in it. It's making me think some of the things that Jung talks about with the Gnostics, and the luminosities that get trapped in matter, that sort of idea.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know more about that than I do.
Well, it does happen in religion and theology all the time, that the objects become the symbols, and there isn't this distance. And then you have a movement that does away with all the objects and goes into a kind of void as a sort of cleansing. You see this in Meister Eckhart, that the meaning isn't, because it's gotten so fixed and attached to certain objects and certain rituals, it's gotten concretized, and it becomes very mechanical. They realize that doesn't have the symbolic punch anymore. That isn't where it's really at. And so there's a kind of, and the Reformation was about that too, get rid of all this, create a void, create an empty space, and let something new come into it. And that the void is, I think, what happens after the end of the world. There is a void. There needs to be a void so that we can have something new. And I think many people, while they fear the end of the world, they also realize that we need a real huge cultural transformation, something vastly different from what we've had in the last couple of centuries. And so this is maybe a kind of preparation for that.
Yeah, thank you. Plenty of email questions, but let me take a spin to Zurich and Asheville. Murray, is there anybody local there that would like to ask a question before we move forward?
Any questions here? Questions? Any questions? No? Not at the moment.
Okay. I know you've got a smaller audience because you guys are on partial break. Asheville, any questions before I take an email as well? Okay, so we're going to go email for the rest, but let me know if any pops up in either site. The email question, this one is from Antioch University in Seattle. Please elaborate on archetypal and symbolic meaning across cultures and the persistence of certain images to attract the imagination. For instance, hell and heaven. Is the dark abuse of symbolic power an essential aspect of psychic balance and even transcendence for the collective? Did you catch all that? That can be for either.
Well, I'll take a crack at it to begin.
Okay. Good luck.
Before you do, I'm going to have
type as a universal. Okay, he's talking about universals. So what he means by archetypes is not finished mythologiums. Mythologiums are the products of culture, and so you find the myth of Hercules, stories about Hercules in Greek culture, and you find the story of Gilgamesh in Near Eastern culture, and so on and so forth. Each culture has its own particular version, you could say, of an archetypal element. He talks about motifs or tendencies for energy to form patterns in certain characteristic ways. And one of those is the pattern of the hero. Okay, so you can find variations on the hero across cultures. The hero, the savior, the one who intervenes in a difficult time to make things better, to save the people, and so on. So there are many varieties of the hero. Similarly, the mother, nurturing, or an example that he gives is the wheel. Jung was fascinated by circles and mandalas and wheels, and he felt that if you went into any culture in the world, you would find at any time you would find circles somewhere in their iconography, or in their dreams, or in their religious practices. You will find circles, and circles that are divided in certain characteristic ways into patterns of 4, 3, something like that. So this, he felt, was fundamental to the human imagination and to human psyche. Archetypal patterns are universals, but they aren't universals like Plato's ideas, the idea of a chair or the idea of a house or something like that. Maybe in a more general sense, the idea of justice, the idea of love, big ideas that you can find cross-culturally, could have archetypal underpinnings to them. If human beings cross-culturally and throughout time keep coming up with a notion of justice, a feeling for justice, fairness, and so on, you could say that's typically human. It's an archetypal pattern. Now, when these patterns are put into images and held up and thought about and reflected on, they become meaning. They become the meanings by which cultures orient themselves. They are myths that they live by. And from the stories are derived certain laws and regulations and customs, and it gets brought down into very specific forms in each culture. But if you trace it back far enough, you would find an archetypal idea or motif behind it. Aesthetics are another one. The idea of beauty may vary from culture to culture what people think is beautiful, but the idea itself, that response to something beautiful, is a human response. And so the aesthetic response is a very emotional, very profound, very visceral response to something that you're experiencing. Now, Jung has been criticized often for, having these absolute universals, sort of Platonic ideas, but I think that isn't really understanding him very accurately. He wasn't just a Platonist, and he thought of archetypes as forces, as psychic forces, not just patterns, but they're patterns that elicit a lot or attract a lot of energy to them, and give that energy form and can transform psychic energy. So they're really, we talk about archetypes, archetypal images, so they're forces that human beings experience throughout time in different cultures. And when we talk about symbols, it's very much related to these archetypal forms, that the symbol captures the form, transmits it across cultures, across time. It's a kind of accessible entry into the energy that the archetypal image contains or is channeling, like an icon. An icon is an image of a god or an angel or a supernatural being, but it's not the object that's magical or important. The object is important in the sense that you need it, like a window. You need it to look through into another space. And if the icon works for you, touches your psyche deeply, then you will experience the archetypal world through it. It becomes a symbol for you. Symbols are like windows into the invisible world of instinct and archetypal energies. So when I go to Russia, and Warren has been there many times. I've been there quite a number of times. I go into the churches and I watch people's behavior in those Russian churches and how they treat their icons and go up to them and meditate on them, pray to them, pray into them, sometimes kiss them, get very close, and you can see that something's happening there. Their psyches are being moved. They're really in contact with, we say something inside themselves, in their psyches. That's our way of thinking about it, but who knows? Maybe they're in contact with something outside their psyches as well, and in a spiritual world. That's what they would say. So these are effective symbols. Symbols that are effective connect us, link us to something that's deeply unconscious that we can't experience in another or better way. It's our access point. We can think about them. When we think about them, we can make meaning out of these experiences, meaning that will sustain us and satisfy our souls. They're nourishment for the soul. It's a symbol is soul food. That's what a symbol is. It feeds the soul. And people without symbols, or people who lose their symbol systems, starve to death. I mean, you see this in indigenous cultures, lose their religions and all become alcoholic and without direction and meaningless lives. And it's a very, very sad picture because they've lost their access to soul food. Symbols are soul food.
Yes. Remembered, Warren, I think you had to leave early. Warren, have you slipped out, or are you there? Needed a...
So I'm going to make a very brief, extremely complicated question. It is a very difficult question in terms of, because I think it's really about what archetypes are and where they come from. And I was kind of hinting at that at the beginning. I think there are certainly there's no question that there are these forces in the psyche. But I think that Jung's hypothesis was an absolutely fascinating one. And I think the reason that Jung has various different explanations as to what archetypes are and where they come from is because, in a way, the hypothesis came first, and he then looked for the best way to try and understand that hypothesis and gather evidence for it later. So it seems to me that the archetypes are actually quite complex things, which engage psychic forces, very strong affects, visceral, as Murray said, but they also exist in a context of culture. And cultures tend to throw up the same kind of situations, the same kind of conflicts that then produce very similar symbols. I think this might offer a way of understanding the way that archetypes emerge, because again, this is an important way of thinking about it, that would make it easier to see them as not having to prove that they are necessarily universal. The kind of issues that may arise in different cultures at different times may vary, but there is clearly, as Jung showed, a great similarity. And it would also help to avoid getting caught in one of these either-or questions about are they biological, are they part of our inheritance, are they purely cultural, do they exist in some other spiritual realm? But actually trying to put that together and make that happen as a theory that would, I think that develop what Jung was trying to say about archetypes is there's a lot of work there, and as I say, it's a very interesting question, but I shall have to leave it in that unfinished state.
Well, thank you. Are you going to hang in the last 10 minutes?
I'm going to have to slip out now.
Your participation, we greatly enjoyed it.
Hi, Warren.
For joining us. That was fabulous to have a new site there. We've got about 7 minutes, and I don't want to go over because the ATH folks have been so kind to go into their Friday evening now for us. So we'll want to wind up on time. I do have one question I think there'll be time for. Obviously, this will be for you, Murray, since you're the remaining fella. There is a big movement of people who are very worried and pessimistic about the state of the global economy or climate change, etc. Is this something becoming too concretized? This is from Debbie. Any?
Well, you and I have been talking about a future seminar on psychology, as it's called by some people, and we have an analyst here in Zurich, Bridget Egger, who will join us for that seminar. And she's trained as an ecologist right here in this university at the ETH, and she's also a Jungian psychoanalyst, and brings these two perspectives to bear. So she will talk about energy as a symbol, the symbolic value, symbolic meanings of energy, and because energy is one of the big issues. She can also talk about water. She can talk about many subjects that are dear to the hearts of ecologists and green folks. She's green herself, very much so. But I think when it comes to issues like that, you could take a symbolic approach and think about it symbolically, psychologically, but on the other hand, it's also something that is a part of the real external world. It's not part of the psychological world only, it's part of the natural world that is being studied, measured, investigated, researched. And now when you get the data from scientists and all their research, and usually a scientist, a researcher, is very non-committal about what the data means. He says he's got some numbers and figures, and you ask him, well, what's the meaning of that? And he's very careful and cautious about what he says. He doesn't want to overstate anything. He sticks to the data. That isn't very satisfying for people in the press or people in politics or people in public life. They want to have something they can get their teeth into. And so a certain process of psychization, you could say, gets going, where data is taken to another level, and in the interpretation of the data and the research, into that can creep important psychological material. You can start projecting into data. You can start developing very strong fears and feelings about the data if you imagine its future trajectories. Scientists usually don't go in that direction, but people who are relating to the data in a different way than a scientific research way, and perhaps out of another archetype than the research archetype, let's say the mother archetype, the one who cares for the planet, the one who cares for children, the one who cares for animals, the one who wants to make sure that everybody's safe, that there will not be an end to the world, and that nature will not end up rejecting the human species because we're so detrimental and overusing the resources of the planet and so on. Those kind of people coming out of that attitude, you could say, and that perspective, are going to develop certain lines of thinking that have a lot of emotion in them and have a lot of appeal to them and a lot of symbolic meanings attached to them. And so you can, in the debate about global warming, for instance, you get people who deny that it even exists. You get other people saying, are you crazy? Go look at the poles, look at the glaciers in the Alps. Of course it exists. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What's under that are very strong feelings and very strong emotional, indeed even archetypal roots. I remember years ago, my doorbell rang. I was living in a suburb of Chicago. In the evening, the doorbell rang. It was a summer evening. I went out there. It was around 7 o'clock, nice evening, and a young man was at the door, maybe 16 years old, and he was collecting money for a green cause and raising money to save the wilderness somewhere in North America. And I got into a little conversation with him and asked him about why he was doing this and what it meant to him. And at one point, he looked into the yard and at the trees, and he said, well, can't you see? Look at the trees. They're suffering. They need our help. And we both stood there practically in tears. He had touched me. He was touched. He was moved. There was something profoundly emotional and psychological about this. Trees, I mean, before he told me that, the trees looked fine to me. I mean, they needed a little water maybe or something, but I wasn't gripped by the archetypal force of his message. He was an evangelist. He was giving me a global message, and I better pay attention. And I was deeply moved, and I emptied my wallet for him. I was very touched by his religious fervor. So archetypes get involved in this conversation, and symbolic meanings, and I think we have to be a little careful, step back, as Warren so persuasively said, things are not symbols. They carry symbolic freight, symbolic meaning, and we need to peel back a little bit and have some reflection on that. But that doesn't mean that we also remain apolitical and just observe. We do get engaged, and we try to make the best judgments and follow our own intuitions. Our intuitions come out of this. Intuition is the closest to this nuclear core of the four functions. Intuition is the closest to the unconscious. So when your intuition tells you, run to the north, the fire is going in the direction of the south, you better run to the north. Your intuition maybe knows something that your rational functions don't know at all. And they're actually using intuitives in firefighting situations in California, I read in the newspaper the other day, because the intuitives somehow know where the fire is going next. I mean, how do they know that? That's like animals. Animals sometimes know when an earthquake's going to happen. So we sometimes know more than we know. And symbols can help us be in closer contact with the instincts and with the archetypes, and so can our intuition. So that's what it means to live the symbolic life, in my view, is to stay close to the unconscious, listen to the dreams, listen to intuition, try to keep that bridge in good repair, and stay in touch with the other side, your lunar mind or your unconscious mind.